just want to introduce our speaker. I had no permission from the elders to do this, but that's the privilege of being the father-in-law, I guess. I want to present to you someone I'm very proud of and I love very much, Stephen Wilson.
All right.
Thank you. It's good to be here. As far as introductions go from Mr. Rakes, it could have been a lot worse. It is good to be here with you this morning. You only have to put up with me for one morning. You know, there's that saying, you don't know how good you had it until it's gone. And I think that was in the back of Tracy's mind when he asked me to fill in for him. Because you're going to welcome him back with open arms next week. I want to turn over, and I got to get this thing going. I want to turn over to Philippians. Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3, that's where I want to spend some time walking through these verses with you this morning. Before we do that, though, I want to kind of set the stage by talking about a concept of different ways of looking at the world, because I think it kind of sets the framework for what Paul's going to talk about. Recently, about 2.5 weeks ago, I took my son, Ryder, who just turned 5, to Disney World, to the Magic Kingdom. The most magical place on earth, and I kind of wondered, magical for who? And it's really interesting as an adult to sit there and watch the kids, especially the kids that are there for the first time, the really young children, walk into the gates and their eyes get big with wonder, and they see this kind of world that maybe they've seen on TV or read books about come to life. Mickey and Minnie live there. They have their dogs that you can go and take pictures with. There's a castle. Winnie the Pooh's there. They're in awe. They're enchanted, really, is the term I would use. They're enchanted with that experience, and you can see it in the way they look at things. Ryder turned to me. All we had done was ride the monorail, and he said, "My brain is loving everything that we're doing right now." That's an enchanted way of looking at things. That's the term I want to use. It's enchanted. They see there in the physical reality things that are beyond just what their eyes see. Whereas on the other hand, I have a very different view of that experience. He sees these people, the children see these characters come to life, and I'll be honest, these are real thoughts I've had. Where does Disney get all the mulch that they put down? Like, they can't buy that at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's just too much. And they have their own mulch farm. When do they mow? You never see them mowing the grass at Disney. And they're open until midnight, and then again at 8. When are they mowing their grass? How do they get the people from one place to the other without you seeing them? You know, I have a very, what I would call a disenchanted view of that reality. And that's kind of, I want to use those terms, an enchanted view of reality versus a disenchanted view of reality. If you think of that, we really do that in our lives, don't we? We purposely disenchant uncertainty. A child comes because they can't sleep because they're afraid of a monster under their bed. To them, that holds some kind of sway, some kind of power in their minds, doesn't it? Because they are uncertain, they don't know. And what do? We say, there's no such thing as monsters. We disenchant that reality. Does that make sense? And if you think about it, we do it in a lot of different things. We do it, you see someone do a card trick, right? How did they do that? What's your first question? All right, show me how you did that. Right? You want to know the answer because you don't really want to live with the uncertainty of how they achieved that. And the term disenchantment really came to the forefront around World War I in social sciences. And I just don't want to get too academic, but I think this is important to describe not a concept of an enchanted world where there's spells and potions and goblins and fairies, but to describe a world in which rational, scientific understanding took a precedence over belief. Rational, scientific understanding took precedence over a belief in something beyond your control. And if you think about it, we really do live in a disenchanted world where in our day-to-day lives, there's no room for a reality that's beyond what we can explain. There's no room for a reality that's beyond our ability to explain it. In Ephesians Paul talks about, we're not going to read the whole chapter 3, but Paul talks about a mystery that has been revealed through Christ. He talks about this mystery, and Paul says, listen, the mystery of the Christ has been hidden throughout all generations until now, until the coming of the Christ. And that mystery is that the salvation of God is for all people, not just Israel. That's what we're getting to. And that mystery has been revealed through Christ. It has been revealed to Paul, and he is sharing it with the believers to bring them into an understanding of what the mystery of the gospel of Christ is. So let's go ahead and read, starting in verse 14. For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being. Let's just stop right there. What's Paul's prayer for the believers in Ephesus? That they may be strengthened. His prayer is for them to be strengthened. Now, we're going to come back, he's going to come back to this idea of strengthening, but what is doing the strengthening? What's Paul's prayer that's doing the strengthening? The Spirit. The Spirit of God will strengthen the believers. Where? Not a physical strengthening, not to make them physically stronger, but where? In their inner being. He prays for strength in their inner being, which I think we could call your soul, the spirit within you. He prays for them to have strength. Let's continue. So here's the reason that we need the strength from the Spirit. So that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. So the reason that we need to be strengthened by the Spirit is so that Christ may dwell in our hearts. And it goes on to further that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have the strength to comprehend. Again, this idea of strength Paul comes back to it, to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. I'm going to stop right there. The prayer for strengthened through the Spirit in your inner being is so that we can have the strength to comprehend the love of God that surpasses knowledge. We can have the strength to know the love of God that surpasses knowledge. And what's the reason that we need to know the love of God that surpasses knowledge? He's going to say it here at the end of these verses. That you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And that's it. That's it. Paul's prayer for the church in Ephesians is ultimately that the Spirit gives them strength to comprehend the love of God so that they can be filled with the fullness of God. And that's a significant point. Okay? Listen to what Paul doesn't say. Not to tread on your toes, but listen to what Paul does not say. He doesn't say, I pray that you may know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may go to heaven when you die. He doesn't say that. He says, I pray that you may have the strength to comprehend the love of God so that you may be filled with all of the fullness of God. Yes. And that's the salvation message, isn't it? That we, as believers, have the fullness of God within us. That we live lives that are filled with the Spirit of God. And I'm not trying to downplay going to heaven, but if you read Ephesians, he doesn't really talk about it anywhere. He keeps coming back to this idea of living life now in the fullness of God. Now, I will suggest to you that's a powerful message. And it's not just a powerful message, but it's quite literally powerful. It gives us a power that is beyond ourselves. What does it mean? I mean, we can say that, well, okay, we're Christians, we have the fullness of God within us. Great. What does it mean for us to have the fullness of God within us? Well, let's go back and look at these verses that Paul talks about. He talks about strength. He talks about knowing. He talks about knowing something. I pray that you may have the strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth, length, and height, and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. Now think about that for a minute. to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. That doesn't really even make sense, does it? How can we know something that's beyond knowledge? How can we comprehend something that's beyond comprehension? Well, I would suggest to you today that Paul is talking about something here, a knowing that goes beyond an intellectual understanding of something. That I can know about someone, but knowing that person is something entirely different. And here's my illustration. There we go. I hope you recognize the person on your left is Sir Winston Churchill, the leader of the free world in World War II. And the individual on the right is also Winston Wilson, my dog. Well, I named after Winston Churchill. I say we, our family named after. If you know me at all, you know that I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill. I've read books about him, I've watched documentaries, I've read his biographies. But unfortunately, I never met him. I never had the opportunity to meet Winston Churchill before he died. I know a lot about Winston Churchill, but I don't know him. Now, Winston Wilson, on the other hand, to the best of my knowledge, no books have ever been written about him. Yet, I'm working on one. I haven't read anything about him, but I know him. I can tell you before he does when he's going to bark, who he's going to bark at. He always barks at Bill Ray's. I can tell you, based upon the sound of his bark, what he's barking at. I can tell you he's barking at a person he thinks he doesn't like. I can tell you he's barking at an animal. I can tell you when he's barking because he wants to get in. I can tell you when he thinks he can get away with stealing one of the kids' food because no one's watching, or when he knows that I'm keeping tabs on him. Now, I could write all this down into a little pamphlet and say, hey, if you read this, you'll know my dog. Yeah. You understand me following that? I just know it. It's something I can't even really explain to you. I just know, well, that bark means that he wants to come in. Paul, I think, here is talking about a knowing that goes beyond intellectual knowing. It's a experienced relationship of Christ. That you may know that which goes beyond knowledge. We can read all we want about the salvation of Jesus, but until we walk in our lives with Jesus, with the fullness of God within us, we're never going to be able to grasp the knowing that goes beyond knowledge. And really, that's the quest that we're on, is to know the love of God that surpasses knowledge. And I would suggest, how do we do that? Right? That's the question. How do we begin to experience and embrace the fullness of God within us? Because Paul says that it is there, that you may know that which is beyond knowledge, that you may experience the fullness of God in your inmost being. And that's where I want to come back to this idea of an enchanted way of looking at things and a disenchanted way of looking at things. Because I think that bears on how we approach God. Because if we are honest, we are an enchanted people. Right? We came together this morning, as Mr. Wilde led us. We surrounded the table of God and affirmed what? What did we affirm? That the God of heaven sent his Son to earth to walk as a man, to be fully God and fully man, to die and then to be raised from the dead. Not a metaphorical raised from the dead, but literally raised from the dead. That's an enchanted view of reality. Are you with me on that? That is something beyond what our rational minds can explain, and yet we believe it, don't we? At least I hope we do. Amen. Don't we believe, if we are honest, that we are an enchanted people that believe that the power of God is within us? The power of God is imbued, His Word, it's filled His Word to give us the power for life and godliness, the power to live an abundant life. But that is an enchanted way of looking at the world, beyond what our minds can explain. And yet we live in a world that has taught us to live predominantly disenchanted lives because we want to be able to explain everything. And if it can't be explained and understood, then there's really no room for it. If we can't rationally digest and explain how this or that happened, well, then there's really no use for it. That's the world that we live in predominantly. Now, I'd actually suggest that in some situations that's actually changing. That people have gone so far in that direction of disenchantment that they hunger for enchantment. That people are hungering to see life as bigger than just what they can explain. And the thing is that we have the answer to that. That we have the enchantment of the Spirit that lives within us, the fullness of God in our inmost being. We have to re-enchant our view of reality. We have to re-enchant our day-to-day lives, knowing that the fullness of God is within us. And how do we begin that process? How do we begin that process? I don't want to stand here and tell you, here's how it happens. I don't really think anybody can do that. All I can really share with you is here are some steps that I've taken that I've seen as useful for me to step into a re-enchanted reality that embraces the power of God in my day-to-day life. And I've kind of broken it down into three general areas. The first is we have to recognize where we are. With the phrase of everyone is, I have to recognize where I am. And that is that I live in a life that is disenchanted, that does not look for the hand of God moving in my day-to-day life. Because the first step to changing anything is recognizing where you are. If you want to lose weight, you first have to figure out what you currently weigh. Otherwise, you'll have no reference point. You know, I think the values we talk about changing our culture in the church, a valuable practice for us to do is to ask the question, well, what is our current culture? What are we changing from? We have to recognize that, you know what, by and large, I see life as a kind of a disenchanted series of events. And until I do that, I can't take any forward progress to see the hand of God, to see the fullness of God in my inmost being. The second thing to do is practice. I did not come up with this term. I read it, and then I couldn't find where I read it, so I apologize. I can't cite it. Practice concrete everydayness. What does that even mean? You know, if you've had a spiritual experience, a spiritual high, what we maybe call a mountaintop experience, maybe at a retreat or a seminar you've gone to, you felt God moving in your life, maybe even just after your baptism and your conversion, you just feel the power of God within you. You know, it's easier to see God active there. And the reality, too, is that I think that in the low points of suffering, when people come around you and you see the hand of God through them, you can see God's movement in your life. But what do you do in between the mountaintop and the valley? Like tomorrow and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, where it's just kind of the same day-to-day stuff that you normally do. What do you do to see God in those moments? And I would suggest this idea of practicing concrete everydayness, where you look for the divine in the daily experience. So first we remind ourselves that, you know what, to re-enchant my life, to see God as active and moving in my life, I have to recognize that that's kind of fighting against the tendency the world has built into me. And so to go against that, I have to re-enchant my reality by looking for the divine in the daily. Where's the fullness of God in the moments where you're just driving the car? Where's the fullness of God when you're at the grocery store or just at home? Until we begin to train our hearts and our minds to be attentive to that, we're going to have a hard time seeing the movement of God in our lives. And then the third step is a term that I call uncertain gratitude. And I think this is an important point because, listen, later on in Ephesians, Paul tells them to give thanks in all circumstances, to give thanks in every situation. And sometimes that's easy to do when we know exactly what the situation is. It's easy to give thanks when we've seen God's hand in our lives, so we give thanks for that. But what do you do when you've gone through the day and you look back and candidly, because you're not trying to bluff yourself, you're going to say, you know what, I think I really struggled to see God active in my life today. You have to be honest about that. Don't try to pull the wool over your own eyes. If you've really struggled to see that honesty is important to you and to God, actually. But even in those times where you necessarily don't feel like you've seen God active in your life, you say a prayer of thanks, even though you're not really sure what it's for. Okay? Even though you're not really sure what it's for. Thank you, Lord, for being with me today, even though I never even noticed. And, okay, so what's the point of that? That sounds like a meaningless prayer. Well, the prayer is not necessarily for God as much as what is it doing to you. That you're then attuning yourself to say, I wasn't as attuned to the presence of God, to the fullness of God in my inmost being today that I could see it, but I give thanks anyway, knowing that He's there. Thank you for being there with me, even though I didn't see it. Because we don't doubt that God is with us, right? We don't live in that uncertainty. We know He's there. We know that the fullness of God is within us. And that knowing is a knowing that goes beyond knowledge, isn't it? A few nights ago, our daughter Olivia was kind of, I don't know if she's teething or what. She had a fever, so she's kind of up a couple times during the night, and I admittedly was kind of getting, you can ask Ashley, patience is not one of my strong suits in a lot of situations, and by the second or third time that she had woken up crying, I was kind of, at my limits for how patient I could be, but I picked her up and I took her out to the sofa and I sat there hoping that Ashley would come out. She did. Thank the Lord she did. But while I was there on the sofa, on the edge of getting really frustrated with a baby that really does not deserve to have me frustrated at her, the term uncertain gratitude popped in my head. It just popped in. Isn't that weird? Isn't that just random? Isn't that, brains work weird ways, right? Chemicals, synapses, they fire and weird words come to mind. That's a disenchanted way of seeing reality. Yes. Do you understand? That is disenchanted way. But we don't live in a world that's disenchanted. We live in an enchanted world that sees the movement of God in our lives. So while a disenchanted response to that is like, wow, that was just random. Okay, fine. An enchanted response, the response that I want to have is, God, thank you for bringing that to my mind when I was going to lose my patience with a 9-month-old. So we give thanks for that. We give thanks for that. The gratitude flows out of the love that God opens our eyes to. The reality is, I think, that God is not always going to feel, those moments aren't always going to come every day, day in and day out. We're just going to feel attuned to that. But it's still important to be grateful, even when you don't notice, because it's that gratitude that shapes your heart for the next day. It's that gratitude that shapes your heart to be sensitive to Him the next day, and the faith to know that He will be there. We are an enchanted people that live in a world that's disenchanted, but it's crying out for enchantment. It's crying out for a meaning beyond itself. It's crying out for a meaning beyond just what can be explained by rational thought and science. And that answer we have is the fullness of God within us. And it's that salvation that we bring. It's that salvation that we bring to the world. But first we have to bring that salvation to ourselves. It's nothing that we do. The Bible is very clear on that. It's nothing that we do. It's the gift of God. But we have to re-enchant our lives so that people can see the enchantment within us. And that makes all the difference. We're going to stand for a song in just a moment, and I want to close with the last verses of chapter 3. And think about what Paul is praying as he speaks of what he wants God to do, because it is an enchanted way of seeing the world. It's an enchanted way that he calls us into a world beyond our ability to explain. And if you would, let's go ahead and stand as we say this prayer together. Verse 20. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we could ask or think, according to the power at work within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever.